Tonight, a 35-year-old military leader's words are shaking the foundations of international diplomacy. From Washington to Paris, world capitals are scrambling to understand Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the youngest head of state who's delivering a message that's igniting what some are calling a continental revolution. I'm Sarah Johnson, and this is Global Focus. Good evening. What started as another military coup in West Africa has evolved into something far more significant. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso isn't just another strong man seeking power. His speeches on African liberation are being shared millions of times across social media, resonating with young Africans from Senegal to South Africa, and forcing Western powers to reconsider decades of foreign policy. For those unfamiliar with this rising figure, Traoré seized power in Burkina Faso through a coup in September 2022. But what's captured global attention isn't his path to power. It's his uncompromising vision for African independence that's challenging everything we thought we knew about modern Africa's relationship with the West. Reporter Sarah, in his most recent address to thousands gathered in Ouagadougou, Traoré delivered what many are calling the most provocative speech by an African leader in decades. His central message was crystal clear. Africa must break what he calls the invisible chains of neocolonialism and forge its own destiny. Standing before a sea of young faces, many waving Burkina Faso flags, Traoré declared, "A nation that cannot control its own currency cannot claim to be truly independent. A continent that exports its wealth only to buy it back as finished goods is still enslaved." The crowd erupted. These weren't just words, Sarah. They were battle cries that have since gone viral across the continent. Anchor. And that viral spread is unprecedented, isn't it? We're seeing his message transcend borders in ways that traditional Pan-African movements never could. Reporter. Exactly. TikTok videos of his speeches have garnered over 10 million views. WhatsApp groups across Africa are sharing clips with captions like, "Finally, someone speaks our truth." Young Africans who've never set foot in Burkina Faso are calling him their president. This digital revolution is creating a pan-African consciousness that's deeply concerning to Western policymakers. To understand why his words carry such explosive power, we need to look at modern West Africa. Burkina Faso, landlocked with 22 million people, has been battling Islamic insurgency while struggling with poverty despite being rich in gold and other resources. It's a perfect example of what Traoré calls Africa's paradox, being resource-rich yet remaining poor. Anchor. Joining us now from Washington is Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Professor of African Studies at Georgetown University, and Marcus Johnson, who served 15 years in the State Department's Africa Bureau. Dr. Mitchell, when you hear Traoré's message, what are we really witnessing here? Dr. Mitchell, Sarah, we're witnessing a generational earthquake. 60% of Africa's population is under 25. They didn't experience colonialism, but they've grown up watching their resources flow out while poverty persists. When Traoré says Africa has been independent for 60 years, but still can't control its own destiny, that resonates powerfully with young people who see French companies controlling their uranium while they lack electricity. His genius is connecting historical grievances to current realities. When he points to the CFA franc, used by 14 African countries, he's highlighting something tangible. These nations can't print money, can't devalue currency for competitive advantage, can't pursue independent monetary policy. For young Africans, that's not abstract economics. That's proof of continued control. Anchor. Marcus, from a U.S. policy perspective, how significant is this challenge to American interests in Africa? Marcus Johnson. This is potentially the most serious challenge to Western influence in Africa since the Cold War, Sarah. The United States has spent billions building partnerships through AFRICOM, development aid, trade programs. We've positioned ourselves as the alternative to Chinese and Russian influence. But Traoré's message is, reject all external influence, pursue complete self-reliance. What's particularly concerning is his appeal to young Africans who will be tomorrow's leaders. If this philosophy spreads, we could see a fundamental realignment where African countries turn inward, potentially creating space for other powers to fill the vacuum. Reporter: let me break down the core pillars of Traoré's liberation philosophy, because understanding these is crucial for American audiences. First, economic sovereignty. Traoré argues that true independence means controlling your resources from extraction to final product. He points out that Burkina Faso exports cotton, but imports finished textiles, exports gold, but lacks jewelry manufacturing. This dependency model, he says, keeps Africa perpetually subordinate. Second, monetary independence. The CFA franc issue is central to his argument. 14 African countries use this currency, backed by France, requiring them to deposit 50% of foreign reserves in the French treasury. Traoré calls this taxation without representation and demands African monetary unions. Third, security autonomy. He's been highly critical of foreign military bases, whether French, American, or others. His argument: how can you be sovereign when foreign armies patrol your territory? African problems, he insists, need African solutions. Fourth, cultural renaissance. This might be his most powerful message. He calls for Africans to reject the mentality of inferiority, to take pride in African achievements, languages, and traditions. When he speaks in local languages during international events, it sends a powerful symbolic message. Encore. Dr. Mitchell. He's often compared to Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader from the 1980s. How significant is that connection? Dr. Mitchell: it's absolutely central to his legitimacy, Sarah. Sankara ruled from 1983 to 1987 and transformed Burkina Faso's image. He reduced government salaries, fought corruption, promoted women's rights, and famously said, "He who feeds you controls you," while pushing for food self-sufficiency. Sankara was assassinated in 1987, and many Burkinabe believe it was because his policies threatened French interests. By positioning himself as Sankara's heir, Traoré taps into powerful symbolism. Sankara is viewed across Africa as a martyr for African independence, and Traoré's rhetoric deliberately echoes Sankara's anti-imperialist stance. When Traoré says, "We will not be the generation that accepts crumbs from our own table," he's channeling Sankara's spirit while speaking to contemporary frustrations. Encore. Marcus, let's talk practical implications. What does this mean for American businesses operating in Africa? Marcus Johnson: American companies need to fundamentally rethink their approach, Sarah. The old model of resource extraction or market access, without significant local value addition, is increasingly seen as exploitative. If Traoré's philosophy spreads, companies could face serious backlash. However, there's also opportunity here. Businesses that genuinely transfer technology, build local capacity, and create African-owned supply chains could benefit. The key is moving from extractive relationships to partnerships that build African capabilities. Take technology companies, for example. Instead of just selling products to African markets, they could establish research centers, train local engineers, and develop Africa-specific solutions. That aligns with Traoré's vision while serving business interests. Reporter: the international response has been swift and largely negative. France has reduced aid and imposed sanctions. The European Union has suspended certain partnerships. The United States has limited military cooperation. But here's the paradox. These punitive measures seem to be strengthening Traoré's narrative. When Western powers impose sanctions on African countries that assert independence, it reinforces his argument about neocolonial control. Young Africans see these sanctions not as responses to military coups, but as punishment for refusing to submit to Western demands. Encore. And social media amplifies this message dramatically, doesn't it? Reporter: Absolutely, Sarah. Traditional diplomacy worked through government channels and elite networks. But Traoré's message spreads directly to millions of young Africans through their phones. They're not getting filtered information through their governments or traditional media. They're hearing his speeches raw and unedited, and they're sharing them with friends across the continent. This creates a new form of Pan-African solidarity that bypasses traditional power structures. When a young person in Kenya shares Traoré's speech about African dignity, they're participating in a continental conversation about independence that their own leaders might not support. Dr. Mitchell: What's fascinating is how this digital Pan-Africanism is creating pressure on established African leaders. Presidents who've maintained close ties with former colonial powers are now facing questions from their own youth about why they're not embracing Traoré's vision of independence. And sure, let's address the criticisms. Traoré's rhetoric is popular, but Burkina Faso still faces enormous challenges. Security threats persist, poverty remains widespread, and infrastructure is lacking. Can inspiration alone solve these practical problems? Marcus Johnson: That's the million-dollar question, Sarah. Traoré's message resonates emotionally, but governing requires practical solutions. Burkina Faso needs investment, technology transfer, and international partnerships to address its challenges. Complete isolation could worsen conditions for ordinary citizens. The challenge is whether he can deliver tangible improvements while maintaining his anti-Western stance. If his government can improve security and economic conditions, his credibility will soar across Africa. If conditions deteriorate, it could discredit the entire liberation movement. Dr. Mitchell: But we shouldn't underestimate the power of dignity and self-respect in development. When people believe in their own capabilities, when they reject narratives of inferiority, that psychological shift can catalyze real change. Traoré's message is giving young Africans permission to dream bigger and demand better from their leaders. Reporter: The geopolitical implications extend far beyond Africa's borders. As Traoré challenges Western influence, other powers are watching carefully. Russia has already increased engagement with his government, offering military cooperation and economic partnerships. China, while officially neutral, sees opportunities in a continent turning away from Western partners. This creates a complex strategic environment where Traoré's call for self-reliance might actually increase dependency on non-Western powers. The question becomes whether genuine independence is possible in today's interconnected world, or whether it's really about choosing different partners. Anchor: Looking ahead, what should American policymakers and citizens understand about this movement? Marcus Johnson: First, this isn't going away. The grievances Traoré articulates are real and widespread. American policy needs to address legitimate concerns about exploitative relationships rather than simply opposing any challenge to Western influence. Second, the old approach of working primarily through African governments may no longer be sufficient. We need to engage directly with African civil society, youth organizations, and grassroots movements to understand their aspirations. Third, our development and business models need fundamental revision. Programs that create dependency or extract resources without building African capabilities will face increasing resistance. Dr. Mitchell: I'd add that Americans need to understand this movement isn't anti-American per se, it's pro-African. There's still tremendous goodwill toward the United States across Africa. But that goodwill is conditional on America supporting African development rather than just pursuing American interests. The choice facing American policymakers is whether to adapt to this new African assertiveness or resist it. History suggests that adaptation leads to better long-term relationships than resistance. Anchor: The story of Ibrahim Traoré represents more than one leader's rise to power. It's a window into Africa's changing relationship with the world and the aspirations of a generation that refuses to accept the status quo. Whether his vision of complete self-reliance is achievable or even desirable remains to be seen. But his message has already changed the conversation about Africa's place in the world, and that conversation is spreading across the continent through the phones of millions of young Africans who are hungry for change. For American viewers, understanding this movement isn't just about comprehending events in a distant country. It's about recognizing that the world's youngest continent, with the fastest growing population and some of the richest resources, is reimagining its future. How America responds to that reimagining will shape relationships for generations to come. The revolution Ibrahim Traoré speaks of may have started in Burkina Faso, but its echoes are being heard from Lagos to Nairobi, from Accra to Johannesburg, and those echoes are growing louder. Thank you for joining us on Global Focus. I'm Sarah Johnson. We'll continue following this story as it develops. Good night.